guys, it's Angelo, and today we're covering my first Shadow Priest rated battleground guide in World of Warcraft Legion. This is my first RBG guide, and in comparison to a lot of other players, I'm certainly not the highest rated player, but I think with my rating floating around 2.2k and sometimes 2.1k rating, I feel confident and experienced enough to present you guys a solid and thorough guide. Even though many aspects of PvP are vastly different than those from PvE, you'd be amazed at how many tricks come in handy that you can take over from PvE to PvP or vice versa. The Shadow Priest itself is a very diverse spec in RBG, despite the common belief of being a simple dot class, and can do some serious damage to the enemy if played correctly, on top of beautiful CC capabilities and support for your team. In this guide, we'll be covering the essentials and what to keep in mind, your optional talents, or rather optimal talents and honor talents, and how to properly apply your damage, and how to play against certain combos, how to effectively support your team, and tips and tricks in form of macros and hotkeys. Should I forget to mention anything in this guide, please let me know in the comments below, and should anything be unclear to you, don't hesitate to inform me about that as well. Now, of course, without any further ado, my friends, let's go right ahead and have a look. First off, let's cover what your role as a Shadow Priest is in an RBG. Though there are many things we do very well, our job in a rated battleground comes down to two very important things. Building immense pressure on the enemy team, especially their healers, while also relieving pressure from our team and especially our healers. What Shadow Priests lack in raw single target damage and cooldowns, they make up for in AoE damage and therefore widespread pressure. Fortunately for us, rated battlegrounds are the perfect setting for us to excel in, as you'll always have more than 3 or 4 targets in front of you, typically even 5 to 6 or 7, and can go completely crazy if you know how to dot and how to maintain said dots on all targets. Ironically, you as a Shadow Priest are arguably one of the best counters to an enemy Shadow Priest as well, because you're able to take away most of their damage by using your Mass Dispel correctly. Which is the other thing we do so well, supporting our team. The Mass Dispel, paired with Vampiric Embrace and your own formidable self-heal with things like Vampiric Touch, as well as your CC capabilities with Mind Bomb or Fear, and of course your Mind Control, can literally make or break an entire game. Don't Mass Dispel enough, and your healers may go out of mana early, or can't out-heal the incoming enemy damage. Forget to stun a warrior that's staking on one of your healers, for example a paladin, and that healer may very well die, leaving your team down a healer amidst a Zerg or a group teamfight. As you see, the Shadow Priest brings a lot to the team, and managing all of your strengths is key to success. Now, let's start going into detail by looking at how to properly apply pressure. Now, to properly apply pressure, and to do your job well in general, you'll want to use the best talents in an RBG setting. In your level 15 talent row, Twist of Fate is your only viable option, and actually ties in perfectly with applying heavy pressure. Body and Soul in your level 30 row is the option which makes the most sense, as you won't always be in Void form to use Mania, and Masochism isn't really needed, and will hardly ever really be used since you seldomly cast Shadow Mend. In the level 45 row, Mind Bomb is your best option, as it's on a low cooldown and can be placed on any enemy target rather than being based off of you and your own proximity, like Psychic Voice or rather than Psychic Scream if you take that. Dominant Mind is unusable in PvP as it does not work on enemy players. In your level 60 row, you will pretty much always want to run Lingering Insanity, as the key to your damage lies in extended teamfights, or Zergs, where you will jump in and out of Void form more than just once. Reaper of Souls is not necessarily bad, it just loses out in a 10 vs 10 setting to Lingering Insanity, and Void Ray should not be used, as it is outperformed by both other talents in that row. Auspicious Spirits in your level 75 talent row should be your go-to talent here, and will be a very important factor when applying pressure. Shadowy Insight can also be used, but works best if you're facing a heavy melee comp, so for example 4 melees in the enemy team, which will most likely target you early on, leaving you with little to no time to actually cast. Sand Lane loses out here, as you won't be casting much Vampiric Touch against melee comps, and if you are able to cast a lot, then Auspicious Spirits just does a lot more damage and, as I said before, applies a lot more pressure, especially when paired with your PvP talent Initiation, but more on that in just a second. In your level 90 talent row, Misery is your best and essentially only choice, as applying both dots at the same time is crucial to establishing a foundation of pressure. Finally, in our level 100 talent row, we have Legacy of the Void as your best option, with Shadow Crash coming in at a relatively close second. The reason that Legacy of the Void is typically a lot stronger though is that, depending on the enemy setup, enemy players will move around a lot, which lets you run risk of completely missing your Shadow Crash, losing not only a significant amount of damage, but also a significant amount of immediate pressure on the enemy healers. Legacy of the Void puts you on the safe side, as it's 5% extra Void Form damage and earlier access to Void Form to allow for a more constant playstyle. Now, when looking over to your honor talents, your options are equally limited but can vary depending on the enemy setup. Gladiator's Medallion is typically the best option, but Relentless can be used especially if the enemy team is on a low MMR, or if they either have way too much hard CC to even make the medallion really relevant, or they don't have enough hard CC to really keep you down. In your second row, Initiation should always be used when paired with Auspicious Spirits, as these two talents in combination with one another will literally create incredible pressure on the enemy team, to the point where anything you have dots on will most likely never be at 100% health, so that's obviously a good thing. Mind Quickness is also pretty strong and should be used when running with Shadowy Insight, as it allows for an overall smoother Void Form with the extra 6% haste. In your third row, I personally always take Pure Shadow, as the 95% damage reduction while in Dispersion will literally prevent melee trains from bursting through your Dispersion as they could without the talent, and the 6 seconds of free Insanity afterwards will allow you to easily reapply all of your dots onto the targets in combat and maintaining your Void Form. Void Shield can be used, and so can Fleeting Embrace, especially when you want to support your healers. However, Pure Shadow will typically be your best option. In your fourth talent row, Void Origins is your must pick, as the instant Void Form is actually very important, and the instant Void Eruption will therefore be uninterruptible, allowing you to jump into Void Form with a lot less risk attached. In your second to last row, Psychic Link will deal the most damage and actually applies a serious amount of pressure, but Shadow Mania can be used in some situations. For example, if you're not as comfortable with Shadow Priest in PvP yet and want the extra insanity to buffer some small Void Form mistakes you may still be making. Once you've mastered your rotation, however, Psychic Link will be your best option at all times. Mind Trauma is not really cut out for rated battlegrounds, as it takes a lot of time to ramp up, requires you to channel Mind Flays all the way consecutively, and on top of this can unfortunately be dispelled. In your final row, Psyfiend is your go-to option and is your strongest option in any given scenario. Void Shift's cooldown is too high to make it worthwhile, and Last Word, even though applying decent pressure, does not allow your team to one-shot a target, similar to the way Psyfiend does. Now, the talents highlighted in green are, as always, your optimal talents to pick, while blue is situational, as I had just stated. So, now that we're on the same sheet of music when it comes to talents and honor talents, let's talk about how you'll be applying pressure. In essence, you'll want to be dotting up everything you can, as dotting up targets is your #1 priority at all times. So once an enemy gets dispelled, or once you see dots dropping off, you always want to refresh them immediately. Apart from dots, you will want to try and maintain your regular PvE rotation as good as possible, so using Mind Blast and Mind Flay until you can enter Void Form, which is when you'll use Void Bolt as often as you can to refresh your dots and fill in with Mind Blast and Mind Flay in the meantime. Should you see your dots dropping, again, immediately recast them using Vampiric Touch in combination with Misery as a talent and continue your regular rotation. If enemies are grouped, try casting your Void Bolt onto the most centered enemy player in order to let Void Bolt extend the dot duration on as many enemies as possible, and should more than 3 players be stacked, for example in a melee train, Cast Mind Flay to spread the damage onto all players during, or rather using your Mind Seer. Void Torrent should be used once you have a solid dot chain running on as many targets as possible, and only once you are safe enough to channel it for the entirety of 4 seconds. Ideally, you'll want to use it when you're at low insanity, but the chances of you being able to pull off a solid Void Torrent at perfect conditions are relatively slim, to be honest. Dispersion, unlike in PvE content, should never be used to extend your Void Form duration. You'll want to hold on to Dispersion until you get targeted, as it is your one and only defensive cooldown available, apart from, of course, external healer cooldowns. Now, to re-summarize, your damage rotation here again is dotting up targets, and that is always your priority, followed by your regular PvE rotation. Try maintaining these important factors, and you shouldn't really have a problem in most battlegrounds. In melee heavy groups specifically, things will typically run a little bit different. You won't have much time to cast, as you will constantly get interrupted, stunned, or simply pressured, which forces you to adjust your playstyle. If you're tunneled by more than 2 melees at almost all times, you want to rely on your Shadow Word Pain to do most of the damage, and your Auspicious Spirits to get you into Void Form. Should you be playing with shadowy insights and mind quickness, you'll find yourself getting into Void Form quickly, despite having melees tunnel you, as the Mind Blast procs are instant casts and cannot be denied. Ultimately, the amount of casts you'll be able to get through depend entirely on the enemy team in this case. Some teams will focus their entire damage onto you until you either die or the enemy team wipes, while others will swap targets after they see you're getting healed too much or just won't die. Try reacting according to the situation. When fighting ranges, or rather a range-heavy enemy composition, your job will be a lot easier to carry out, as you'll be dealing with a lot less interrupts and less hard CC, which is unable to be avoided. Here, you'll want to try and keep certain ranges from using their hard-hitting abilities as frequently as you can, while of course remaining as much damage, or rather maintaining as much damage as possible. If a Boomkin is trying to get a full moon through, for example, be sure to pressure him out of the idea, either through damage, through a mind bomb, or through a silence. Even a mind control obviously works. If your team requires your CC on another target, be sure to use it accordingly, so don't just waste your CC abilities to interrupt random abilities, but rather use them effectively. Next up, let's talk about something that is equally important, if not even more important, than doing high amounts of damage: supporting your team properly. Now, the best thing you can do as a Shadow Priest, which essentially diffuses a lot of the enemy's pressure on your raid, or rather your team, is to Mass Dispel. Mass Dispel is on a 15-second cooldown and removes all harmful magic effects from 5 teammates within a 15-yard radius, while also removing 1 beneficial magic effect from 5 enemy targets. What makes Mass Dispel so strong is that it's able to dispel even the strongest of magic effects, those that typically can't be dispelled, like Ice Block from a mage or Divine Shield from a paladin. So as you can tell, Mass Dispel will not only take away pressure that sits on your team, it will also take away pressure prevention from the enemy team, allowing your DPS to continue focusing a target which is usually untargetable during certain buffs. If possible, try keeping your Mass Dispel on cooldown to allow your team to continue whatever they're doing as usual. If there is nothing to be dispelled, obviously don't worry about it, and if there's only 1 or 2 targets which are debuffed, your healers will typically take care of that. If it's 3 or more, you'll certainly want to MD or Mass Dispel to remove those debuffs quickly. The other big support you offer as a Shadow Priest is Vampiric Embrace. Now, Vampiric Embrace, or VE for short usually, needs to be used very carefully though. It only heals 1 target, and it only heals based off of 40% of any single target spell damage you deal during its uptime. This means that dots do not directly allow for more healing, however, any direct spell damage, so Mind Flay, Mind Blast, Void Bolt, and the Shadow Word Pain initial damage will heal one of your allies. The best idea is to use Vampiric Embrace once you're in the middle of your Void form, so that you have a bit of haste to cast faster, and will typically be using a lot of Void Bolts, Mind Blasts, and perhaps even a solid Void Torrent. Vampiric Embrace should be used either in a big team fight or when you're defending your flag carries and he is getting pressured or she is getting pressured by the enemy offense. Speaking of offense and defense, is the Shadow Priest more of a defensive class or more of an offensive class? Shadow Priests actually work best when used as a defensive class. This means that you should defend your flag carrier in a Capture the Flag or Flag BG, so Warsong Gulch and Twin Peaks, and you should be one of the last players to leave a Zerg or a team fight when a base gets attacked in, for example, the Orathi Basin or the Battle of Gilneas. Shadow Priests work best when they are allowed to do what they do best, which is dealing a lot of damage. Moving around the map a lot is not our strength, as we are kind of immobile and therefore should be taken into consideration. That said though, your Scyfiend can come in extremely handy in Capture the Flags, where an enemy flag carrier with high flag debuff stacks will literally get destroyed by a simple Scyfiend application. Again, just keep these things in mind when playing, and be sure to have a team that knows your strengths and weaknesses. Finally, I want to talk about macros, which are important in a PvP setting. Displayed on screen now are macros that I use, and I believe that those should definitely be used when in an RBG. Having a cancel aura macro for your dispersion is incredibly handy, as you don't have to sit in dispersion for 6 seconds most of the time, as most enemies that are on you will switch targets once they see you have dispersed. Only a small amount of enemies I face will actually notice me cancelling my dispersion quickly enough to swap back onto me immediately, and obviously the less time that you have to sit in dispersion doing nothing is the better. You'll also want a cancel aura macro for mind control, which is important when you're mind controlling someone so that a teammate can cap an enemy base, or when you're mind controlling a melee that's sticking on your flag carrier, and so on. Lastly, you want to use mouse over macros for your dots and your void bolt. Now, I've talked about mouse over macros extensively in a lot of my previous videos, and if you want a full guide on those, be sure to check out my Shadow Priest rotation video or my add-ons and macros videos. Good use of macros and mouse overs will definitely see you improving your gameplay after you've learned how to use them, of course, so I can only recommend you start using them as soon as you see fit. Overall, Shadow Priests are currently in an outstanding position when it comes to battlegrounds. Especially rated battlegrounds at that, as our damage capabilities as well as our team supporting abilities are incredibly useful, and Shadow Priests are at the foundation of many team compositions currently due to what they can bring to a team. Even though very squishy and quickly bursted down if the player is unattentive, Shadow Priests are incredibly dangerous if left alone or if supported by their team, and can literally cause an entire enemy team to crumble within mere minutes. I truly hope this guide will allow you to improve your gameplay and will see you climbing the RBG ladder. If this guide was helpful to you, a like would be much appreciated, and if you want to see more of my content in the future, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and a special thanks as always to my supporters over at Patreon who help the channel out a lot. You're so much appreciated, believe me. Now, as always my friends, have a good one, and I will see you all in the next one.